all over the place. This is the Hartford Bus Center, which I've got quite a bit of time in, Hartford, Connecticut. Mayors were coming out all over the land to cut the ribbons. Harry Lesko was appointed president of Greyhound Lines East. Harry was a very dear friend of Jim Kerrigan's and would go on with him when Trailways was bought out. This is the only picture I've ever seen of a Nigeria Greyhound. I can't even remotely tell you what really transpired over there. As you can see, it's one of the rebuilt 4104s. The silver siding between the windows is gone and all that. They were quick to get hooked up with the new Disneyland in Florida. Oh, I mean, big time. Believe it or not, Greyhound Van Lines was still with us, still doing fine. At least for the people who are in control of Greyhound at present. It was making a profit. Greyhound still had a reputation, and there's still plenty of prestige. Another sort of a first, at least for me, was that in 1970 I sold my very first picture to Greyhound. I mean, I got paid for taking a Greyhound picture. $36.91. I boarded her in the South Boston Greyhound garage, rode down to New York City with Mr. McCormick, and rode back. It was a turnaround, because now you could achieve that because of the opening of all the turnpikes. When I first rode a Greyhound from Lynn to New York City, an express was 8.5 hours. The average was 13. This did a turn. 4 hours and 45 minutes, 4 hours and 30 minutes we were in New York. Still in 1971, what was the queen of the fleet? The Greyhound office car? Now, does that look familiar to you, that windshield? Does that lower level down there look familiar to you? It was a Scenicruiser. Greyhound 001. The boss's bus. This was the boss's bus. Of course, they had not yet bought custom coach. That was many, many years away yet. But that was her galley section. 1971 saw them get really smart when they created suburban Greyhound stations. Now, up before this, 90% of the time you had to go way downtown. Like if you were in Chicago, like this picture here, you had to go all the way downtown, because when Greyhound hit the Chicago city limits, she didn't stop anymore. She just went to the loop. The arrival of the MC-8, not only was it put in big time into Greyhound service, it was the first. There was some sales of the MC-7 to private operators, but this car here took off. It was the first nail in the coffin of General Motors truck and bus division. The MC5s and the MC5s and MC7s were still well entrenched, but the MC8 was coming on big time, and now the MC5s were being relegated to second-line coaches. All the GMs were going bye-bye. Only a few would be left. Now this is really a beautiful lesson in people not doing their homework. Here they decided they'd run this old full color from the Chicago American 1923 Greyhound ad. I'm sorry. It wasn't 1923. It was November 17th, 1925, according to the masthead of the newspaper. A Sea Safety Motor Coach, Greyhound Limited. Look at this route structure. This was years before Wickman out in Hibbing, Minnesota, had carried the name Greyhound. This was Carl Ekstrom, the original creator of Greyhound Lines, and history has been corrected many times here at IBC, much to the dismay of a lot of people at Greyhound who you're never supposed to question, ever. They moved. They moved from Chicago to Phoenix, the new corporate headquarters, and created themselves a giant tower. More and more stories were appearing in the Greyhound employee publications of the mighty Armour and Company. They were starting to outweigh the Greyhound bus information. There was already a state-of-the-art Greyhound terminal built in 1969 in Phoenix. The terminal is still in existence today and still used. But a lot of them question why spend these millions and millions of dollars to move from Chicago, which was a perfectly nice city? It's hard to say. I know Chicago was not a very good city for Teats. There were some people there that wanted him in a bad way out of circulation. But that terminal was quite a far cry from this, the original Phoenix terminal. Again, Pacific and Southwestern Greyhound lines were famous for drive-thrus. They didn't like buses backing up. Of course, it was impossible to rule the mother out altogether. But less and less was being said about Greyhound and more about their other interests, particularly their Hormel and Armour meatpacking businesses. Greyhound Rent-A-Car was floundering badly. It wasn't doing so terribly good. $45 a week, and Greyhound Rent-A-Car introduced something that quite a few operations still carry over to this day, and that was the first free mileage of a rental car in the history of the nation. Up until then, you were charged by the mile. 1972 saw the introduction of Bus Plus. That was to offset Trailways' 5-star service. It didn't last too terribly long. Wasn't that awfully successful. The Turbine program was still underway. You can see the big hump over the back for the breather and everything. It had some government funding as well. That's why it lasted as long as it did. In 1972, the famous Pepsi scheme came on board. Some people say, well, why does it look like a Pepsi? Why do you say a Pepsi paint scheme? Well, back in those days, if you laid a Pepsi Cola bottle on its side, it looked the same as the Greyhound. Matter of fact, I often wondered whether that's where it was actually literally copied from. However, as most bus fans will tell you, 23 years later, it is a stale paint job. I wish Greyhound had the money to be able to get rid of it, or at least do something with it. They've done a few things. They put some laser lines in and whatnot, but basically it's the same 1972 paint job. Lots of Big Bears are still hanging around. Big Bear, the affectionate name for the MC7. Lots of meat hanging around too. Much too much meat hanging around. No, I have to clarify something here. It may have sounded like there were Greyhound de Mexico buses I said very few pictures ever exist of the operation, but it wasn't. It was a separate company in Mexico to divert people coming north to Greyhound lines rather than Trailways. This is the office in Mexico City. They would come up on Transportes del Norte or whatever to the border towns, and then they'd board Greyhound. This is a view of this is the view of the inside of the terminal at Mexico City. It was very successful in that regard. In turn, Greyhound would book Mexican tours on this side of the border and send Yankees down that way, and Transportes del Norte would carry them, or they may end up on one of Chihuahuensis mighty 12-wheel Sultanas. This was a heck of a bus. You had to see this thing in real life. Oh God, was it incredible. It looked like it was designed by a group that were actually at war with each other. Either that or they didn't talk to each other. But, could those son of a guns go? By the way, if you'd like to see busing in Mexico, we have a beautiful 2-hour video called The Mexican Connection. It is really interesting because look at the nose of this. What's that? That's an old flexible high level, but built by Dina down in Mexico. The Ameripass was invented. Well, needless to say, this thing was a big success, especially with the Europeans. They thought it was the cat's meow. They bought the thing by the gross. Armour continued to push the buses off the pages. All the publications were dealing with the great success of Armour. Boy, oh boy, there were a few blizzards in the north when I lived up there that we could have used this sucker. This is, again, Brewster Greyhound Canada. But what can you say? It's a Greyhound, isn't it? The Mighty 8 was getting strong now, boy. Because this is the original paint job when they had the silver roof up there. Even the MC7s had that silver roof in the front. But as I've already stated, the real success was the outside world was buying this car and putting MCI, I mean, on the map big time. To where they are to still this very day. Here's a rare little piece. This is a complete pamphlet put out on the MC8. You don't see very many of these floating around through the hobby. I think they caught a lot of the fans unawares, and they didn't assault a bunch of them away. It's completely on the MC8. Tells you all about her. Greyhound service, airport service in Miami was still hanging on, still running their Cetras. However, Greyhound Van Lines was sold off to Smythe Transport, a division of, I think it is, Canadian Pacific Railroad, up in Canada. Smythe, pronounced S-M-I-T-H, is spelled S-M-I-T-H. And to me it's Smith, but they call it Smythe, just like they call Gilbert Gilbert. So, you know, what's in a name anyhow? One thing you could say about Mr. Kerrigan is he was stubborn. Was right up to the end, too. This outfit was not doing well at all, but he was going to ride it right into the ground. Canadian Greyhound was still doing fine. The buses were still buying other companies for the Greyhound Corporation. Canadian Greyhound had no problem whatsoever running their coaches. They were allowed to use them. Their MC6s, although they only kept, I think it was 15 of them. But their coaches, unlike the American ones, which were repowered to 8 cylinders, stayed 12 cylinders to the day they left the property. They were awesome machines. They would go straight up that glacier down, and you see in the back down there, at 70 miles an hour. But administrations changed in Washington, And no matter what they tried, Greyhound could not get that 102-inch wide car through. And of course, the production of their new Scenicruiser replacement would come to a screaming halt. Actually, in reality, it was way, way beyond its time. It had some incredible features, including tires made just for it, something Greyhound conveniently forgot to tell you when you bought a used MC6, that there was no way you could put any tires on there except the ones that they had, which were all gone. They were still stubborn. They would not admit that Greyhound made an error, and it was not created in Hibbing, Minnesota. They were stubborn. Oh, Lord, were they stubborn and adamant about that. In 1974, though, this big, giant advertising push was still going on. Kerrigan was utilizing every form of media that he could, and the bill was soaring up. Little by little, this extravagant selling of Greyhound utilizing 4-star media, which is the most expensive in the world, would catch up with him. Greyhound 1 was long gone, of course, in the form of a Scenicruiser, and this was the 1974 Greyhound Executive Coach. It seemed that no matter where an MC8 was, if it stood still for more than 30 seconds, somebody took a picture of the thing. Probably the most photographed Greyhound coach ever. 1974 saw the creation of what we now know as the new Greyhound logo. The dog was moved around several places on it through the year, but it's still basically the same logo. This was the 1974 schedule for the first 6 months of the year that Greyhound would advertise on. Of course, the bus fans loved it. I mean, oh, we thought it was dynamite. But boy, oh boy, some of the upper echelon Greyhound people. And remember, Kerrigan was the president only of the transportation division. There were officers still higher than him, including Troutman. They didn't like the way this thing was mounting up. An MC8 turbine was created. But the most interesting thing about it was look where it went. I mean, whoa. I don't know whether they paid for this, but whatever it was big bucks to send this sucker to Switzerland. She toured around the United Kingdom and a few other places too. So maybe it paid off, but I don't know. The sale of the Greyhound MC8 was so terrific